Chapter 4. Dennis, where are you at spiritually? It was the wrong question at the wrong time from the wrong person. I had cooked and sold meth. I had power over other addicts, which I regularly abused. I used violence to intimidate the people around me. I had been a liar and a thief. Sitting in that restaurant with Patty's family, I had been out of prison for 3 years. I'd been sober for about 6, but I was still living in the darkness. I told myself I wasn't a bad guy. Life wasn't fair, and I was just getting what was owed to me. I did what any else would do if they had the guts. I wallowed in the darkness and kept lying to myself. I'd probably be living that same lie today if Matt hadn't asked me that question. I've been living in hell my whole life, I said. I hope when I die it's better than this. These were the first honest words I'd spoken in years, and I figured they'd cost me. As they escaped my lips, I immediately braced for a sermon. Matt nodded quietly, looking right at me. He seemed to be listening, but I'd been around Christians enough to know he was just waiting for an opportunity to preach. When the moment came, however, all he did was ask another question. What do you think about God? Matt, I told him, the things I've done, the things I've seen. Some of these guys, what they do in prison. I shook my head at the memories running through my mind. I seen a lot of stuff. I went quiet for a moment. Matt didn't start in on how I was looking at everything wrong or how I needed a positive attitude. He was listening. How can God let stuff like that go on? I looked up at him. Honestly, Matt, it's hard for me to believe that there's a God. I see good people, friends of my mom and dad. Good people. They go to church all the time. But then I hear the little boy is dying of cancer, or their daughter was hit and killed by a drunk driver. I shook my head. Where's God? He's not helping people like that. And these are good people. If he's not watching out for them, why the hell would he do anything for a man like me? Even after that, the sermon didn't come. Instead, Matt asked me another question. I answered that one, and he asked me another. I was honest, surprising myself by sharing the truth about who I was, the kind of things I'd done. But no matter what I told him, he didn't seem to judge. We kept on like that for an hour and a half. Everybody else left the restaurant, even my girlfriend Patty, but I barely noticed. Finally, I looked around at the empty table. I grinned. Looks like I lost my ride. Matt drove me home, which gave us another half hour in the car to follow the same pattern. He kept asking deeper questions and listened to my answers. In the driveway, he put the car in park and turned towards me. Here, finally, was the big cell. I had been bracing for it for 2 hours, but all he did was ask one last question. Dennis, if I gave you a book, would you read it? I shrugged. I couldn't remember the last time I read a book, but after 50 years of acting tough, of hiding my pain, I had just poured my heart out to a man I barely knew. Clearly, it was a night for new things. I told him I'd give it a look. He handed me a copy of One Heartbeat Away by Mark Cahill. I turned it into my hands. It was short. I liked that. I thanked Matt for the ride and the book, then stepped out into the cool night. I felt strange, exhausted, but lighter. Inside, Patty gave me a questioning look, but I didn't have much to say. I couldn't really put into words what had just happened. Besides, I had a book to read. Cahill hooked me at the first page, and I read until I fell asleep. The next day, as soon as I got home from work, I picked it up again. I kept going that night until I finished it. It was a little after 9 o'clock. Our son was asleep. The house was quiet. On the last page were 2 prayers. One, a prayer of salvation. The other, of condemnation. Don't go to sleep tonight, the author wrote, without praying the prayer of salvation. If you didn't, then by default you prayed the prayer of condemnation. I fell to my knees. I knew the prayer of condemnation. I'd been praying it for 50 years. I'd been lying to myself and everyone else my whole life. I'd been living in hell, but I was done with it. I wanted Jesus. I closed my eyes in my living room and gave my life to Christ. Even as I prayed, I could feel everything change. My whole life I had been missing something inside of me, a hole in my spirit. I had tried to shove drugs and alcohol, violence and power into that hole, but nothing worked. I tried to act like I was okay, like I had everything together, but I was miserable. For the first time in my life, I didn't have to lie. Jesus filled in that hole in my spirit and took care of the pain and garbage that went with it. The next day when I woke up, I couldn't stop smiling. It was like my first day on earth. It was like I could see for the first time. I called Matt as soon as I thought he'd be awake. He answered after a few rings. I shouted into the phone, "I did it, Matt." There was 1,000 things I could have been yelling about. Knowing my history, most of them were bad. So Matt, understandably, took a quiet moment before he asked, "What did you do, Dennis?" "Matt," I said laughing, "I gave my life to Christ." We celebrated like it was my birthday. I was 51 years old on March 15, 2010 at about 9:20 at night. But it was the moment my life began.